Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting. And today, doing a tasting of something from Ole Smoky. And for those of you who live anywhere near the Great Smoky Mountains or have been to the Great Smoky Mountains, you know Ole Smoky as a moonshine establishment. But they have tried to make whiskey through their years. And in fact, I did an interview with Joe Baker, which you can check out, where he's basically said that, they really would have liked to have started with some whiskey, but it kind of evolved over time. Now they've gone through, they made a Davy Crockett Tennessee whiskey there at one time. They made charred moonshine, and then they were mostly making a blended whiskey that they were adding flavors to. And you used to be able to find the blended whiskey in the stores, but it slowly started to fade away. And when I went to Gatlinburg, I wanted to do a tasting of it, so I went to their barrel house hoping to find some, but unfortunately I couldn't get a sample of it. They still had a bottle on the shelf, but hard to buy something and not really know what you're going to get. And they do make a Tennessee whiskey now. They make a lot of flavored whiskeys, but they have just introduced last year the James Owenby Tennessee Straight Bourbon Whiskey. So the first question I had for Joe Baker, the co-founder, was, is this something that goes through the Lincoln County process? Because if it does, then it wouldn't normally say bourbon, it would just call itself a Tennessee whiskey. But he said that yes, it does go through the charcoal filtering process. So this is technically a Tennessee whiskey, but it goes to prove that it doesn't really have to have Tennessee whiskey on the label, that you can go through that extra step and still call it bourbon. So, like I say, moonshine's what they're normally known for, but here's a chance for us to dive into a whiskey. And so what I know about this whiskey is that beyond the Lincoln County process, it's a straight bourbon whiskey, which means that it's gone through at least 4 years of age. Otherwise, it would have to say somewhere on the bottle how many years it had spent in a bottle. It couldn't be any less than 2 years. And it's 47% alcohol by volume. It is partially from their own stocks, that Ole Smoky. Yes, they are making their own whiskey. You travel through East Tennessee and you go to different distilleries and you're like, they just source all their stuff. No, they don't source all their stuff. They make the majority of it. But in the case of their whiskey, they decided to also source another Tennessee distillery's whiskey and add it in with their own to come up with this. And you want to make a good first impression. Now, if you go on their website, it actually says there is a recipe for a cocktail. And it basically says James Owenby neat. And then it says 3 ounces of James Owenby. I love that. And that was what was great in interviewing Joe Baker. He likes drinking his whiskey neat. And so, they sell a lot of flavored products. And I think his point when we were talking about this, he said, everybody has their own palate, their own thing, and that there's definitely a large market for flavored spirits, but that he prefers to drink his neat and without the flavorings in it. And so it was encouraging to hear, and it sounds like there's more whiskey coming down the road for Ole Smoky. And Ole Smoky is huge. They're doing something right. They have 5.7 million tourists coming through to their distilleries. They are the most visited distillery in the world. And to put this in perspective, Scotland saw 2.2 million visitors to all of their distilleries last year. So they're not even half of it for a whole entire industry versus what Ole Smoky is bringing in. And the Great Smoky Mountains are, of course, the number one. It is the number one national park in the United States. So it makes sense. People come to Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge. You got 4 locations, 3 in that area, 1 in Nashville. You're going to end up having a lot of tourists coming in. I wanted to give you a little history on James Owenby, actually, before I jump in and do this kind of nice sweet nose to it, by the way. The story of James Owenby himself is very limited. We know that he was one of the Over-Mountain men, and I'll tell you about the Over-Mountain men here in a moment, and that he served 6 tours of duty. So he was a dedicated military man, and he started when he was a teenager. He served under John Sevier during the Revolutionary War. And this is how the story goes about the Over-Mountain men. The Over-Mountain men were some of the original settlers in what is now East Tennessee through the Appalachian Mountains. And what happened was they took part in some of the battles. They'd go over the mountain and go into South Carolina when the war was coming south and the Redcoats were getting the Loyalists involved. And so the Battle of Musgrove's Mill, there were a couple of successful battles, but there was a case where in Camden, Horatio Gates, the general for the Americans, had a miserable defeat, and this left a man named Major Patrick Ferguson free to kind of roam the area. Well, the Over-Mountain men went back to kind of regroup in Tennessee at that point. And so it started to look like the war was being taken over by the British at that point. And Major Ferguson was a well-respected Scotsman in the British Army. He was actually at Brandywine, the story goes, that he actually, as a sharpshooter, was considered the best in the British military, and he had put his gun sights on General George Washington when he was on horseback during that battle and could have taken him out. But back in those days, it was a gentleman's agreement that you didn't shoot on the head of the other force, because if you did, it would lead to chaos and carnage, and that really was not seen as a form of warfare that the British wanted to get involved in. Of course, things got a little bit the rules were thrown out the window in South Carolina when Bannister Tarleton came through. If you've seen the movie The Patriot, they fictionalize his character under another name, but it's basically, Bloody Ban was using any technique that he could to basically subdue the colonists. So anyway, long story short, we get back to Patrick Ferguson, and he sees that the Over-Mountain men have left the battle, and so he decides to dig the knife in a little deeper, takes a prisoner of war, sends him to tell John Sevier that the Over-Mountain men should not come back, because if they do, they will be wiped out. And so, being the mountain men that they were, John Sevier and the Over-Mountain men said, forget this, we're going back down, we're going to take care of this. They go down through North Carolina to Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain is basically a hill, lots of trees around it. Ferguson's forces were up at the top of the hill. The Americans came in, including the Over-Mountain men, including James Ownby as part of John Sevier's crew, started shooting tree to tree, making their way up the hill until they finally got to where Ferguson was, and a bullet went through Ferguson. He was killed on the spot, and that pretty much was the end. And what happened was, after that, Cornwallis, for the British, decided it was time to kind of back up and regroup, and so he started taking his forces through North Carolina up to Yorktown, where he didn't realize that the French were about to meet them there on the coast, and that pretty much was the end of the American Revolution. So the turning point, the end here, really came about because of the Over-Mountain men coming down and lending a hand, at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, if you ever go to Kings Mountain, last time I went, I love that once you go up to the top of the hill, and there's a monument there, and as you make your way back down the hill, Patrick Ferguson has a monument there. And at first it caught me when I first saw it. I thought, Patrick Ferguson? Wait, he was the enemy. But there was such a respect for the man that he is revered on both sides. And so there is a monument to him there where he fell in Kings Mountain in South Carolina. A lot of people think Kings Mountain is in North Carolina. It's actually south of the border in South Carolina. That's my history lesson for today. I'm telling you, the baking spices and the caramel on this are beautifully sweet with a little bit of a herbaliness coming through from the rye on this. Slight bit of oak, but it is, I mean, it's really like it's fitting this comes from Gatlinburg, because when I think of Gatlinburg, I think of pulled taffy and, you know, that kind of sweetness and that really sweet caramel. And it's not a flavoring at all. So don't be thinking that this is you know, this is something like their salty caramel that they've added some flavoring to this. It's not. It's just a really nice, sweet nose. And on the palate, some of that nice, sweet caramel comes through again. It's like reminds me of a McDonald's sundae when they pour the caramel over the top. What's interesting though is it goes into rye spice, and the caramel actually, it's like a curtain unveils this rye spice, and you've left the room that has the caramel in it. There's like an echo of it, but you're really left with more of a rye spice and char finish on this, rather than having that sweetness that you got at the beginning and in the middle. So it's an interesting journey to get here. But this is a good whiskey. I look forward to seeing what Ole Smoky does in the future in terms of whiskeys. This is a limited release, so you're probably only going to find it in areas that aren't too far away from the distilleries. But check online, because on their website they actually do have information about where you can buy it. So maybe you can find it around. So kudos to Ole Smoky for coming out with a whiskey and for doing it right, because I think this is a nice representation for them. And I love the history part of it. And he gave me a chance to tell the Patrick Ferguson Over Mountain Men story, which I love that story. So there you go. So if you enjoyed this, you learned something, you enjoy a little bit of history with your whiskey review, give me a like down below, and also, you know, subscribe if you'd like to watch more of these videos as we go. And until next time, cheers and slanjava. Nice.